Harold, a man with a bulldozer heart and dollar signs in his eyes, eyed the ramshackle cottage. Prime real estate, perfect for luxury condos. The old woman who lived there was a nuisance, a wrinkle in his grand scheme. He'd offered her a pittance, of course. She'd laughed. He didn't like that. He'd make her pay. The demolition crew arrived at dawn, their machines rumbling with predatory hunger. Harold, smug in his suit, watched as they approached the cottage. The old woman stood on the porch, a silhouette against the rising sun. Her voice, when she spoke, was surprisingly strong. "This land has seen empires rise and fall," she said, her words echoing strangely in the morning air. "You and your machines are but a fleeting shadow." Harold scoffed. He'd heard it all before. He signaled to the foreman, a burly man with grease stains on his overalls. The foreman nodded, a cruel grin spreading across his face. The bulldozer roared, its metal jaws poised to tear into the cottage's fragile walls. But the old woman didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her eyes burning with an ancient fire. Harold felt a prickle of unease. He pushed it down. Sentimentality wouldn't make him rich. The bulldozer halted, its engine sputtering. The foreman swore and slammed his fist against the controls. Nothing. Harold strode forward, his anger overriding his unease. "What's the holdup?" he snarled. The foreman pointed, his face pale. The bulldozer's metal teeth were inches from the cottage, yet they couldn't touch it. An invisible barrier, shimmering faintly, protected the house. The old woman smiled then, a slow, knowing smile. She beckoned Harold closer. He hesitated, then, against his better judgment, he approached. He had to see this. "This house," she said, her voice a low whisper, "has stood here for centuries. It holds secrets, secrets men like you can only dream of." She stepped aside, inviting him in. Harold, his curiosity piqued, entered the cottage. The air inside was thick with the scent of herbs and dust. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, their meaning lost to time. The old woman led him through a labyrinth of rooms, each one filled with more arcane objects. Harold felt a shiver run down his spine. This was no ordinary cottage. This was a place of power. And the old woman, he realized, was no ordinary woman. She led him to a hidden chamber, its entrance concealed behind a tapestry woven with silver thread. The chamber was small, lit by a single flickering candle. In the center, on a pedestal of carved stone, rested a crystal vial filled with a luminous liquid. It pulsed with an otherworldly light. Harold stared at it, mesmerized. "This," the old woman said, her voice trembling with age, "is the last of it. The elixir of life." Harold turned to her, his heart pounding. "Elixir of life," he echoed, his voice hoarse. The old woman nodded. "A single drop can turn back time, restore youth, grant immortality." She picked up the vial, her hand surprisingly steady. But its power is not to be taken lightly. It is a gift, not to be squandered. She drank the contents of the vial in one swift movement. Harold watched, his breath catching in his throat as the transformation began. The wrinkles on her face smoothed, her hair regained its luster. Her body, once stooped with age, became lithe and strong. The old woman was gone. In her place stood a woman who seemed barely out of her 20s, her eyes shining with vitality. Harold stared at her, his mind reeling. He had to have more. "Where did you get it?" he rasped, his voice thick with greed. The woman, now radiating an almost ethereal beauty, smiled sadly. "There is a spring deep in the woods," she said, her voice clear and young, "a hidden grove where the very essence of life bubbles forth. But it is guarded, protected." Harold didn't care. He had to have it. He would have it. He pushed past her, racing out of the cottage and into the surrounding woods. He didn't know how long he ran, his suit snagged on thorns, his lungs burning, but he had to find it. The spring, the promise of eternal youth. He burst through a thicket of trees and stumbled into a clearing, and stopped. The air shimmered with an otherworldly light. In the center, a spring bubbled merrily, its water sparkling with an unnatural luminescence. But guarding it were creatures unlike any Harold had ever seen, small, delicate, almost fairy-like, with gossamer wings that shimmered with all the colors of the rainbow. Their eyes, however, held an ancient wisdom, and when they turned to look at Harold, he felt a chill run down his spine. He approached them cautiously, his greed battling with a growing sense of unease. He tried to speak, but his voice emerged as a dry croak. One of the creatures, no taller than his knee, fluttered closer, its gaze piercing. It spoke in a voice like the tinkling of bells, yet the words were clear in Harold's mind. "You seek the gift of life," it said, its voice filled with amusement, "yet you do not understand its price." Harold, his desire overriding his fear, lunged for the spring, pushing past the creatures. He reached the bubbling water, cupped his hands, and drank deeply. It tasted like the first day of spring, like the promise of a new dawn. He felt it coursing through his veins, burning away the years, making him feel alive, young, vibrant. He laughed, a sound he hadn't realized how much he'd missed. But the laughter died in his throat. His hands, he realized, felt strangely small. He looked down and his blood ran cold. His hands were the hands of a child. He looked up at the creatures, his heart pounding with terror. They were watching him, their expressions unreadable. One of them dipped a delicate hand into the spring and with a flick of its wrist, splashed Harold with the water. "You sought eternal youth," it said, its voice like the chiming of bells. "But you forgot. Youth is fleeting." Harold didn't understand. He was young again, wasn't he? But his body continued to shrink, his clothes becoming comically oversized. He fell to his knees, his voice reduced to a child's whimper. The last thing he saw before he blacked out was the amused faces of the creatures, their eyes filled with an ancient, knowing amusement. He awoke in a soft bed, his head spinning. He looked around the unfamiliar room, his heart pounding. A woman entered, her face etched with concern. He recognized her instantly. The old woman. No, not old. Young. She smiled at him, her eyes filled with a kindness he hadn't seen in them before. "Don't worry, child," she said, her voice soothing. "You're safe now." He didn't understand. He tried to speak, but only a babble emerged from his lips. She picked him up, holding him close. He felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of security he hadn't known he craved. He was a child again, helpless, dependent. But this time he wasn't afraid. He was home. She would take care of him. She would teach him. And maybe, just maybe, he would learn the true meaning of life, not in the pursuit of eternal youth, but in the simple act of living and being kind.